All right, I think everyone's entering our space. It's a privilege to welcome you again to another iteration of A+D Mondays. If you don't know by now, my name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design, and it's always a privilege to welcome everyone on Monday for a series that is co-curated by a range of campus organizations, including Berkeley Arts Plus Design, my office, as well as the Department of Art Practice, the Berkeley Center for New Media, Cal Performances, Berkeley Art Museum and BAM-PFA, the Global Urban Humanities Initiative, College of Environmental Design, the School of Journalism, basically a range of units who are invested in the relationship between creativity, technology, social enterprise, and the arts. Think together about what it means to work at this synthesis. In particular, working at a synthesis that we've decided to name for this series under the title Together, Reimagining Politics, Reinventing Politics, Reimagining Health, in order to think about how the arts contribute and vivify and perhaps alter necessary redefinitions about what we mean by politics and about what we mean by health, physiologically, emotionally, economically. So tonight's program couldn't be more apt as we think together under the banner of Cité on translating cultures and cities, an initiative that works at the intersection between urban policy, the arts, social enterprise, and equity. It's an initiative that was spearheaded by one of our participants tonight, Juliette Donadieu, who is the cultural attaché of the San Francisco consulate representing France, who's charged with creating meaningful collaborations, comparisons, juxtapositions, and engagements between the Bay Area region and France, the greater French and Francophone culture. And as part of that, tonight, we're extending the conversation to think about what it means to think deeply about the role of the arts and in its contribution to equity, and what it means to think about it across a range of cities. Tonight, we'll be thinking about the Bay Area, specifically Oakland. We'll be thinking about Detroit, Chicago, as well as Paris, the greater Paris region, and especially a banlieue, Saint-Denis. So more ahead, but I should say that in that kind of excavation where one thinks deeply about place, where one thinks about the politics and aesthetics and deep histories, seen or unseen, of the place one inhabits, it recalls also the fact that we must acknowledge the site on which this gathering stands, whether we do so virtually or in person. The fact that UC Berkeley is sited on the unceded ancestral land of the Ohlone tribe, and in acknowledging that fraught and deep history, we acknowledge the need for repair and reformation, as well as the fact that the Ohlone people are thriving members of the Berkeley community and the Bay Area more generally. And so as part of our attempt at UC Berkeley, joining with a range of sectors to come to terms with fraught histories that are political, violent, and sometimes invisible, a protocol like the acknowledgement I just offered has been part of our institutional culture. We joined then with a range of projects in a range of cities and a range of sectors, governance sectors, art sectors, medical sectors, higher education sectors that are undergoing necessary, if belated, redefinition. And I think tonight's conversation joins with that greater project. So as a way to get going, and as a way to get going with really welcoming the incredible crew that we have gathered tonight, I thought I'll offer an introduction to our speakers, and then I'll begin some questions for each of them to tell us a bit more about the different sites in which they work: Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, and Saint-Denis outside of Paris, and to think deeply about what it means to work in a project of translation, what it means to think about translating across cultures locally as well as internationally on a shared project of urban equity. So first of all, it is my privilege to welcome our speakers for tonight. I'll start with Anya Sirota, who is an architectural designer, associate professor and associate dean of academic initiatives at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. She's based in Detroit, and her work and practice works always at the synthesis between aesthetics and social enterprise. Also, Connie Spreen, who is the executive director of Experimental Station in Chicago, and in that role and other roles she's had, she is constantly working to create local initiatives that join cultural practice, neighborhood perspectives, and social enterprise in novel collaborations. We also have tonight Roberto Bedoya, who is the Cultural Affairs Manager for the City of Oakland, our neighbor, and also the former director of Tucson Pima Arts Council. Roberto also is a very distinguished poet whose publications and texts have appeared in numerous venues and distinct publications. Also, again, the guide, the person who is behind the effort to create a genuine transnational conversation about urban arts planning, Juliette Donadieu, who is the cultural attaché for the French Cultural Services here in San Francisco. She's in charge of Via San Francisco, one of our sponsors tonight, along with Berkeley Arts Plus Design, along with the California Humanities Council. We're so grateful to have this collaboration. Perhaps I'll welcome more to the screen and get a dialogue going about what it means to be thinking with this rubric of translation, to think about what it is to translate across vocabularies, across sectors, across nations, especially now, though, with the overarching frame of promoting the arts as a vehicle for engaging in projects of urban equity. So I'll start with actually a phrase or word for all of you that has been subject to a variety of translations. One could say mistranslations or selective hearings, sometimes generative and sometimes less so. And that's the discourse of creative placemaking. This is a discourse for those of us who are deeply invested in the role of the arts in urban planning, has been generated and iterated around a range of projects, especially starting within the United States. It was an initiative, sometimes launched by and certainly supported by the National Endowment for the Arts here in the United States, with the notion that that there could be a very strategic role for the arts in vivifying, dynamizing cities and neighborhoods. And it's a discourse that is in some ways countering, one that often sees the artists in city planning more as the as those who are the early adopters, those who might enter an under-resourced neighborhood, vivify that neighborhood with the arts only to find themselves contributing to a project of gentrification, one that ultimately ends up displacing not only the artists themselves, but the neighbors with whom they might have started to work. So that narrative, I'll say, about the arts as an unintentional gentrifier of urban cities is part of what the discourse of creative placemaking might have hoped to counter. How could we work more in a more complex way, in a more productive way, to join the arts to a project of urban equity that meets neighbors and cities where they are and advances goals for economic vibrancy, for social equity, but does so perhaps in a different way. So this is a kind of discourse that has circulated again throughout our cities in the United States, and it's also one that has been adopted or translated and alternately translated to legitimize a range of projects and to propel a range of projects. Along the way, there have been modifications of the discourse, and one of the key modifications of the discourse has come from one of our panelists tonight, Roberto Bedoya, who's offered the idea of creative placekeeping in lieu of placemaking in order to counter any perception that artists or policymakers are entering a place that doesn't already have an identity. They're not necessarily there to make a new place, but to keep place, to keep the conditions of creativity and social vibrancy that are already there, right? And Roberto, I'm sure, will say much more about what he might mean by that term. So I'll offer our panels tonight just to lob into this discourse as a way to enter the conversation about how you hear that phrase now in relationship to your own practice. Roberto, since I cited you, would you be willing to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, you keep this image up here, and forgive me if this sort of is improvisational as we kind of move through this conversation. This is kind of the cover of a cultural plan that I shepherded called Belonging in Oakland, which in many ways informs how the city of Oakland um, thinks of itself, its place in the world, and and then this also became an important part of the collaboration between the city of Oakland and Saint-Denis. I wrote something for the catalog that Juliette probably will talk a little bit about, where I talk about placemaking. And I want to read a little bit of this uh, just to sort of, to start. Can we have the next slide? Let's see what the next one is. Oh, so that's the plaza in front of City Hall. And this is a view. I'm on the 9th floor and I get to look down at all the celebrations and protests that happened in a public space in front of City Hall. Can we have the next one, please? So this is really key, and I'll just leave this one here. The cultural plan, and I'm speaking as a policymaker now, and I'm thinking about place and placemaking a lot. And there's other new terms that have come uh, up in my world of practice. But the tagline for the cultural plan, which is called Belonging in Oakland, is equity is the driving force, culture is a frame, and belonging is the goal. So let me just read a little from the essay. Uh, I'm concerned how belonging enlivens city life, the aesthetic speech of the city, and how social relations embedded in belonging build civic life, which have informed how social relations, excuse me, I'm not, let me back up a little bit, forgive me, how belonging enlivens city life, the aesthetic speech of the city, and how social relations embedded in belonging build civic life, um, which informed kind of the Oakland Saint-Denis alliance that scaled out trust as a form of kinship that animated us. Both cities are dealing with gentrification and creative placemaking as a cultural policy apparatus that sounds good, but its fuzziness lies in the lack of clarity about creative placemaking as a property rights movement or human rights movements. Our exchange with the knowledge we gained in dialogue on how our two cities address social displacement in our locales. How do we animate community as a verb, not as a noun? How do we lean into relation, not relationships, which can be caged in the transactional exchanges of currencies, but but instead the transformative power of knowing your neighbors, the neighborhood, of being in relation. Relation is within the aesthetic speech of the city, the aesthetic ordering of we, as in the secular we, the people, as opposed to the privatized we of me and my friends. So I spin out a little bit more about the beauty of this partnership, but I think that gives you a little bit of insight to this notion of placemaking and how, in a funny kind of way, it's a very interesting and troubling term. Most recently, as Shannon said, I started writing about placekeeping as a counter narrative, and then I'm hearing from my colleagues in the Southwest a new term, place knowing, which kind of goes back to what Shannon gave the acknowledgement about on a lonely land. We need to know what our land is and what the land brings to our spirits. And maybe we, have high rises. We also have rivers and lakes, and we have streets, and we need to know that. So in some ways, placekeeping, placemaking, and place knowing need to be bundled together in a way in which, for me, it's about looking at the relations in a city, and being an arts person, the aesthetic speech of a city, which is a really wonderful concept I hold out there in my imagination about tied to belonging. So I'll just leave my remarks there. Do I have one more slide? I think I have one more. Those are my peeps. These are Oakland meetings related to
For all our peeps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you do work on the East Bay, you recognize a lot of these people here. Thank you, Roberto, so much. In terms of even getting those that discourse out and the counter discourse, and people could begin thinking about what might be the difference between placemaking, placekeeping, and place knowing as we proceed. But we've gestured to, and now want to go more deeply into the real novel collaboration that really brings us together by welcoming Juliette Donadieu. Juliette, as I said, is the cultural attaché for the San Francisco General Consulate, and all of us who work at Berkeley are often working with the different cultural attachés who come through. But I have to say, there's been nobody who's been more visionary, more vigilant, and more innovative in planning collaborations between the Bay Area in France in my time at Berkeley than Juliette. And it's been such a pleasure to work with you, Juliette. So I wonder if you might back up for all of us and give us a sense more about the landscape that is bringing us together. This idea that you had that it might be an interesting thought in thinking about collaborations between France and San Francisco Bay Area, not only to focus on Paris and San Francisco, but to focus on the surrounding regions of the greater Bay Area and the greater Grand Paris, and to think about a place like Saint-Denis next to the city of Oakland, and what different kinds of comparisons and sort of aha moments come when we do this work of translation in this domain. Juliette, I'll turn the screen to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Shannon. And so yes, I'm Juliette. I'm the cultural attaché. I've been here in San Francisco for the last 3 years, and thank you, Shannon and Paris, for hosting us tonight. I would say, as a cultural diplomat, my mission here is to bridge cultures. But when you arrive here in San Francisco, you hear, when you meet all the different partners coming from the museum, the festival, the arts communities, the university, that, everybody here is facing the same challenges: rising of cost, gentrification, displacements. And I would say that it's, I had the same feeling in France and in Paris. And I used to live in the north of Paris, in the 93. It's in the north of Paris, in the banlieue, that what we all going to talk about tonight. And I think my feeling is like, what, bridging culture, what does it mean? And when you're talking about placemaking, we're talking about place where we live, where we meet people, where we raised our children. And we, I think we all have to, at one point realize that we need to change the perspective and the way we individually do our job. And maybe we need to cross the bridge. We need to cross what we call in Paris the peripheric, and to look at the territories, the banlieue, in a very different way, and to look at those territories and the people who are living and working there as very innovative place. And that's how this project started. The project we called Oakland Saint-Denis is we look at those two territories, Saint-Denis with really wonderful cities in the north of Paris, with also, a very, I would say, incredible diverse city with so many different communities. I think it's more than 160 languages that people have been spoken there, and to see how they're facing those challenges, how we can learn from each other. How can we, put together very different perspectives? I think we will talk about it. Not only, the people who are living, the people who are making those cities and those territories so incredible, and that's what we started 2 years ago. And I like to thank few people. We made this possible thanks to you, Shannon, but also thanks to California Humanities, thanks to French American Cultural Societies and all the different partners from Oakland, the two cities, Saint-Denis and Oakland, but also the arts communities who came together to take the time to learn from each other. And maybe we can, share the 2 minutes documentary. Here, we'll present the project.
Wonderful, thank you.
Je suis là depuis 2 ans et j'arrive de Seine-Saint-Denis. Et tout de suite, quand on veut rencontrer des artistes, on nous dit les artistes sont plus à San Francisco, ils sont à Oakland.
To me, both Oakland and Saint-Denis are cities that are incredibly diverse. They have populations from all over the world. We came together to exchange stories. These two cities are going through very similar things, maybe at slightly different times. One very simple thing that obviously both places are going through is gentrification.
What it means to be an artist in the Bay Area is that in a way you're sometimes feeling you're an endangered species because the cost of living is so high.
Similar to Saint-Denis, there's a lot of industrial spaces, warehouse spaces.
Finalement, dans les deux cas, il y a un enjeu de maîtriser le foncier, maîtriser la durabilité du bâti.
On vient du 9-3, on vient d'Oakland. On a envie de le revendiquer et on a aussi envie de montrer une autre facette de cette ville qu'on vit au quotidien. Le point de départ, c'est une conviction que faire la ville est un acte culturel. On se rend compte qu'il y a énormément de solutions qui existent.
The moment we reflect with another city, it takes us out of our bubble and makes us think, oh, this is a global thing.
All right. Did we get to the end? Okay. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction and the teaser. Juliette and her team and everyone collaborating also has a longer documentation of the project if you choose to share, and we can, it's on our site. Links to the site are on the A+D website if you choose to learn more, and we're gonna help you learn more tonight. For now though, part of what we want to do is to take this Saint-Denis Oakland comparison and exchange and widen the frame, and to work and to welcome conversations with those located in other cities with whom actually Juliette's homologues in Chicago and Detroit have also often collaborated. And so in doing that, I'd like to welcome, I think we'll have next, if you don't mind, Connie from Experimental Station. Yes, her slides are queued up. In order to tell us what kind of work you've been doing there, Connie, and give us a sense of things.
No, I'd be happy to. And this is, just kind of an introduction. You'll get more of a sense maybe as we go through. And I want to say, first of all, that Roberto, I didn't know you before, but I really like you. And I am someone who has long had questions about creative placemaking. My sense has always been that it suggested to me anyway that there was no there. You know, people thought there was no there when they came to a place, that, you know, they were the first one to arrive. And what I've discovered at Experimental Station is first and foremost a place. And it was literally and programmatically built on a foundation of significant environmental and cultural activities that had taken place over decades on a site on the south side of Chicago. And we're in the northeast corner of a predominantly Black and almost entirely Black and low-income neighborhood. And when my husband and I moved there and bought an apartment there 33 years ago, everyone called it the ghetto. And in fact, the name of it is Woodlawn. But Woodlawn is on the south side of a strip of land that is a park, a 2-block park, that it's a very long strip of land. And on the north side of that big strip of land is the neighborhood of Hyde Park, which is affluent and the home of the University of Chicago. And down on the south side of that strip of land, called the Midway Plaisance, is a very impoverished neighborhood. And so there's a very stark and absolute, you know, like break between those two neighborhoods. And they've been historically divided for somewhere around 50, 60 years. And the university would tell people, their students, as they came in to the university, don't go south of 60th Street. And so they didn't. And we lived on 61st Street, which was a street of abandoned cars and packs of feral dogs and abandoned and boarded up buildings. And so what I came to realize over time as well is that you know, the lack of resources in the neighborhood was also the consequence of other local histories. It's a neighborhood steeped in so many different ways in history, its own history. And when I was introduced to the Atelier Médicis, so the Atelier Médicis was introduced to me by the French consulate in Chicago, and I visited there in 2019. So Experimental Station, if you're looking at this image, is on the left. That's a photo from last week, so it is very current, and we have no leaves on our trees. The Atelier is located on the east side of Paris, in the Périphérique, in the east side called Clichy-sous-Bois. And when I visited there, we walked around the neighborhood surrounding the Atelier, and you know, I recognized that there were significant similarities between that place, even though the cultures were very different, and where we lived. And although the cultures were very different, the sense of marginalization felt the same to me. And so we began a conversation at that time about, you know, those sorts of similarities. And out of that conversation and many conversations that took place, and I have to give credit for those conversations to our cultural attaché Tanguy Accard here in Chicago, out of that crystallized this project called Clichy-Cago. So it's Clichy and Chicago, and the subtitle of that project is Communauté choisie ou subie, you know, communities chosen or endured. And it's truly a collaboration between the French consulate, Experimental Station, a number of fellow organizations in Chicago, and Les Ateliers Médicis. And the project is being created as a vehicle for sharing and exchange between these two places with some things in common. So trying to understand what it is that we have in common through exchanging stories, exchanging artists, and exchanging ideas. So that's kind of the basic introduction to this project, is how we can maybe work together and learn from each other about our individual places, and how each of those will maybe inform one another. So if we go to the next slide. I'll give you a brief introduction to Experimental Station. We're a cultural organization on the south side of Chicago, and we have a very broad definition of culture, very intentionally. So the building that we occupy was built intentionally to house a number of different types of programs and activities that came out of a recognition of local needs, the needs in our community. And it began as kind of, had the impetus was around the arts. And so we do a lot of art events and support many different types of cultural producers. And there in the center truly is, the artist, the dancer. But we also run a bike shop and teach kids from the South Side, how to work in a bike business. And on the bottom left, you'll see these are young people. These are my peeps, the young people who on Friday are learning. They're in the bike program, but they also get the opportunity to express themselves through art. And we run a farmer's market because the neighborhood had no sources of food. And so we enable low-income people to gain access to healthy food and help them to afford it. We do, up in the right-hand corner, we do festivals, and other types of community activities. And we're a place that is, because we're not the University of Chicago, we're not some of these other locations, we're very independent, and the space that we have allows for conversations to take place that couldn't take place elsewhere. So some of them are big conversations around public policy, but some of them are just small conversations over beers. And that kind of hospitality is very much an institutional value for us. I liked so much what Roberto said about being in relation. It's very much about being in relation with one another and creating opportunities for that to occur. And Experimental Station strives to be what the French would call a lieu de rencontre, a meeting place where a lot of different people and types of people with varying interests can come together and to share them. So I will stop there for the moment, and we can move on.
Thank you, Connie. That was wonderful. Wonderful introduction. Gives the wider community a sense of what's going on there. As somebody who, my first book ever was on the settlement movement in Chicago, on Hull House in Chicago. And I feel like Experimental Station, I've been, from afar, always seems like it's taking a 21st century, more taking that legacy and making it more bracing and responsive to today. Thank you. So let's, to ground out the reflections on creative placemaking as its generative possibilities, as well as its limits, and also to get a sense of what's going on in her practice in Detroit, I'd like to turn it now to Anya.
Thank you so much. First, it's such a pleasure to be in this particular company because I've been grappling with so many of these terms, and to hear Roberto, Connie, Juliette think about these as well, it's a real pleasure. I have been working for the last 12 years or so around the Detroit area. And in my practice, it's an unorthodox practice. And if we think about the orthodoxies of the field of the discipline of architecture and urban design, it often likes to imagine that nothing precedes us. I think that kind of sentiment came to a frenzied place in the early 90s, when so many architects embraced the ideas of theorists like Marc Auger, who began to describe in haunting poetic terms the idea of non-places, whether those were railway stations or soulless airports. But we also saw professionals begin to apply that term non-place in an undifferentiated way to talk about modernity's failures, to talk about post-industrial landscapes, to talk about urban economic margins. And not long after that, we saw the word creative placemaking emerge through philanthropy, through the NEA, through other neoliberal social enterprises. And it was an attempt in many ways in its early stages to recuperate a sense of place. And that is sort of the understanding that was developed early when I first moved to Detroit. And there was such a notion that there was a kind of idea that the city was a tabula rasa, inviting people to engage in what was essentially an invisibilizing narrative about the people, the communities, the struggles that were inherently there. So if we move on to the next slide, Paris. And we, very early on in our practice, we didn't work in Detroit right away. It took us a very long time to begin to imagine ways that architecture could get involved and what it could do in a space where so little capital was available. It was a moment where we began to think about how if space is something abstract without any substantial meaning, it's something that's more or less calculatable, then place referred to how people were aware of or attracted to a certain piece of space in a particular way. And so place can be seen as a space that has meaning, or it's inflected through an essential direct experience where culture and memory resides. So in Detroit's North End, where we began working about 6 years ago, it's a predominantly African-American legacied historical neighborhood where the majority of the built infrastructure has been dismantled through aggressive blight remediation. So about 70% of the building stock, the architectural stock, is missing. And in this space, without a true institution, without a building, we began a project that we called 1 Mile, the Oakland North End Mile Project. And in essence, it was an idea about an origin story, a narrative about an origin story, that before there was 8 Mile, there was something more centralized, more connected to the history of vanguard music and place. And this neighborhood happened to be where funk music was launched in Detroit, and where Dr. Funkenstein started his career. So in this scenario, what we ended up doing was building a space module, a mobile DJ booth that could be packed and unpacked and relaunched in different locations in order for performances and stories to be broadcast, a kind of broadcast vehicle. So if we move to the next slide. And in this same period of time, we began to think about how space is a practiced place. It's something that we borrowed from Michel de Certeau, so that a place is a kind of material, geographic plane where things happen, they coexist in relation to each other, and that space occurs through an operation on place, that we make space, we take space, we occupy space. And often this is assisted through a deployment of sometimes contradictory or conflictual programs. So in this North End neighborhood with a network of artists, we began to think about ways that we could transform space by engaging the history and memory of place. This project is called the Nomadic Detroit Cultural Council, which was literally a clip-on arch. It's made out of 17 pieces that can be packed into the back of a pickup truck and then deployed to attach to any building to transform it into a regal institution. And the idea here was that we collaborated with a group of artists that were convening and organizing around the idea that Detroit needed an arts council. And that was an office that had been dismantled even before the bankruptcy. And so by clipping this onto any building that was available, any space that was available, we could instigate a parallel institution. So, and if we go to the very last slide, and this is where I'm so excited about place knowing, we're compelled by this more nuanced understanding of place that came with Roberto's definition of placekeeping, and the assumption that every place has its own cultural meaning, its emergent programs, that people need to be respected and recognized and included in all processes of planning, self-expression, and instigation in the public realm. But at the same time, one thing that we began to recognize is that the binary opposition between the keepers and the makers also instituted an opposition between insiders and outsiders, newcomers and old timers. And so that binary opposition could be at times instrumentalized to align with problems of xenophobia or exclusion as well. So in this situation where we continue to work with others on the creation of space that can be appropriated, that can serve for pluralistic purposes, and that can create sites of self-expression, we're constantly trying to render explicit the histories, the prehistories, the layered possibilities that are at once complex and pluralistic. And this is an image from the roof of the Packard automotive plant, where this was part of our, when we were a bit more activist than we are now, a little younger, but a few years back with a group of students, when the Packard automotive plant was going up for sale at auction, we tried to make a case that the site should be public, that it should be a public infrastructure. And so we brought the entry condition to the roof up to code and then created this installation on the roof simply by scraping away the debris and creating space. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Anya, even that last example of scraping debris, an incredible incarnation of Desarteau's notion of space as practice place. And thank you for bringing more vocabulary to our discussion now by bringing in Desarteau, which is appropriate for a project that's also forging relationships between French and US culture. And also for now also helping us think about, the concerns about this binary, about who are the keepers and who are the makers and how that could be instrumentalized. I think it's going to be very important as we continue, especially to the next topic that we had thought we might explore around really looking deeply at this concept of translation. It's the frame for our entire dialogue tonight. But it, of course, occurs in many different zones. On the one hand, we're thinking about translation as something that is occurring across France and the United States. So we have the issue of English and French translation, about what it means to translate across two different cultures. But we also, of course, know that the United States is not one thing, France is not one thing, that within different communities and cities, there's all varieties of internal translation that needs to occur, sometimes amongst communities that inhabit different demographic positions, across those that speak many languages within France or within the United States, as well as what it meant, and Juliette, this is where I'm going to start to welcome you, what it means to work on a project that requires translation across sectors like the arts, like city governance, like real estate development, and as well as the block captains and neighbors that might be really the leaders of their regions or communities. So that in all those cases, there are acts of translation happening where perhaps even the same word is heard quite differently from different places, or where we found, I think, in working on the Oakland Saint-Denis project, that a word that might exist in English is heard very differently in France and vice versa. So to start us off on this, and to make sure we always have the order a little bit more mixed up, Juliette, can you take us into thinking a little bit more deeply about translation?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. And I think it's at the center of all the different projects that we are developing. It's, and I think the first word I would say that it's time. It takes time to understand each other. It takes time to know each other. So I think it's with this project, beyond this project, assuming that we need first to learn, to meet each other, to identify the different person that we need to invite around the table. And so what we did first a different learning expedition. We put together people from Saint-Denis and people from Oakland. We had some people from university, from arts institution, from local authorities, from government. We had some architects, some artists, and then we took the time to travel when it was possible at that time. So we went to Saint-Denis and we came here in Oakland, and it was very, it was very interesting to look at this time and to look at the different conversation inside the group. And I think that's exactly the point. It's like, yes, we are comparing two different cultures. French and American are coming from very different history. We have very different perspective. But when you're putting together real estate developers, arts communities, and local authorities talking to each other, I would say that French and American arts communities have much more in common than real estate developers and local authorities. So that's exactly what we looked at, and putting all those different communities when they were discussing what were the words that they were using and the gap in translation. And that's exactly where there were some gaps that we took the time to look at them. So what you see on the screen, it's Oakland Saint-Denis. It's the publication that we published a few months ago. After all those conversations, we tried to put everything in the publication, which is obviously not possible, but at least it's the first step. And then Paris, you can put the next slide. And what we did, we put this, this kind of gaming translation, putting the different words that we heard during the different conversation all the time. And the word that just maybe some of them, and depending on the people, where do you come from, some of the words have the same meaning in French and in English. Some of the words don't have the same translation. As French people, I think the word that we are hearing here in the US all the time, it's community, which doesn't have the same meaning in France. It's like you would talk about neighborhood, you would talk about territory, but you wouldn't use the same word in the same way. Another word that came, and it's really important, it's racism or race. As French people, we are not talking about it. We are not using the word. We are not even allowed to use the word. And I'm not saying that there is a bad or good solution. I'm saying that looking at those differences and the different way that we are putting things together, it's so important at this time. And my feeling is like we don't have one solution. We have several solutions. And I think looking at what is different, I think it's the starting point to learn from each other. And I think that's exactly what we did. And I think this lost in translation game from one culture to the other is a really starting point, and we really want to continue this.
Thank you, Juliette. And by foregrounding the importance of allowing oneself to get lost in translation, about also recognizing that there will not be a perfect translation, that there will be gaps in translation, that one word is not heard or used in the same, and not to put a value judgment on it, but actually to decide what can we learn from the fact that some things are not easily translated. What does that show about ourselves and about different cultures, and what can we learn from it? That seems a huge part, I think, a huge part of what it means to work generatively with the idea of translation. And Anya, I know that in Detroit and as part of your wider practice, you've been thinking about keywords and the exchanges around translation as well over there. And I'm really excited for you to share some of what you've come up with in terms of your own lexicon and vocabulary.
Sure. Juliette, so many of these words are conundrums culturally, but also within our very own context. This is a model of the Detroit Cultivator project, which is an urban farm and civic commons that we've been partnering with the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm for the last 4 years. And this year, it's the first land trust in Detroit. And that's always been very surprising to us that in a city that has 25% of its land owned by a land bank and another 25% of its land owned by speculators, why aren't there more land trusts or more cooperative forms of land management? And it dawned on us that some of the terms and ideals and ideologies attached to what we considered as common good might not be shared by all of our partners and all of the residents, and that capital accumulation might be something that's very deeply bound to the idea of self-management and autonomy. It was one of the projects that that sort of inspired us to think more broadly and to instigate a collaboration with a number of partners, including Tanguy Accard from Chicago and the University of Grenoble in the Alps and others. And if we go to the next slide, one of the very first things that we started to work on with the University of Grenoble is working with students to understand the rifts and the gaps between certain terms that we take for granted or we think we understand, and then rendering explicit their radical differences culturally helps us actually shine a light on our own conceptions and our own suppositions about those terms. In particular, the suburbs, the banlieue, there couldn't be a more radical understanding or misunderstanding of those terms. And like Juliette, you said, these questions of community, of diversity, of race, we really begin to understand ourselves through the lens of others. So this is an ongoing project. And if we go to the next slide, we think even about the etymology of terms between the two cultural contexts. And the idea of community is something that emerged from les communards in a situation where for the first time, there is a group of people that share an ideological position about resistance that are imageable as a group, that can therefore be oppressed as a group. And then how that term begins to translate itself and be transformed across borders to mean a slew of different things. So even just taking this one word and tracking how we begin to understand community in the United States and in this context and in France opens up the possibility that with every project, we are responsible for redefining or defining collectively what we mean by the terms that we take for granted and use. So for example, in the sense of community, if we are of privilege, we assume that we operate within a plethora of different communities. We can occupy many communities all at once. And often marginalized communities are geographically localized. So opening up the definition of community to include both the geographic location of where people live, the ideological community that can be cross-border, and the ephemeral community that begins to emerge when we produce programs, performances, and interventions that bring us together for however short a period and illustrate that a pluralism of experience can be possible. When we begin to layer all of those multiple meanings of community, something more rich and evocative begins to emerge. And I think I have one last slide, and this is about the Acts of Urbanism project, which we're launching at the Grenoble Biennale on Saturday. It's another parallel institution where French performance artists, Detroit performance artists, artists from Grenoble, Saint-Etienne, Detroit, are meeting together in virtual space to begin to collaborate and to think about the context in which they work, the definitions with which they operate, the instrumentalization of the contexts that allow them to produce work, and what those meanings can be and how they can be transformed. So these are just a few images from the participating artists, and it's a project that has a number of partners, including the University of Michigan, the Cité du Design, the Pacifique in Grenoble, the University of Grenoble, and the Consul General in Chicago. So we stop there.
Oh, fabulous. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for that, Anya, for telling us here at the end about informing those of us who are thinking about, Bay Area in relationship to France, to tell us a bit more about a collaboration with Grenoble, but also how clarifying just to have that lexicon in front of us that you shared, and to start to think about different ways of hearing all of those words. I wonder now, Connie and Roberto, if you might also tell us a little bit more about how this word translation as a practice, as a puzzle, operates in your world. Connie, you want to start off?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, I actually have a PhD in French literature and raised my kids in French. So I've really operated much of my life in a foreign language. And so I'm very aware of the challenges of translation, both across languages and also across cultures. But I've also seen, and I very much appreciate this idea that has just been, Juliette and Anya have talked about working generatively with gaps in translation. I think that is really interesting and an exciting way to think. In my kind of more on the ground type of work, which is where I am, pretty much every day, I have also come to see how what Roberto calls being in relation, that establishment of human connection becomes this powerful force that can transcend sort of these gaps in translation and create these moments of connection that are very meaningful. And so I just have this one slide. And what is interesting to me, this is a photo of Madame Christiane Taubira, who visited Experimental Station. She's the former French Minister of Justice and the person credited with the passage of gay marriage in France. And she visited a couple of years ago. And in the day or two beforehand, I had mentioned to the young people in our bike shop that she was going to be visiting, and I described her achievements and how I admire this woman. I didn't mention that she's of African descent. She's from French Guiana. And in this photo, Madame Taubira is reaching her hand out and shakes the hand of this young man. And this young man had, for the previous year or two prior to that, gone from being a very outgoing young man to being one that was completely surly and withdrawn, uncommunicative, wearing his hoodie, about this close around his face. And some things that happened in his personal life that made his family tell him that he had to give up his plans for the future, which had included even going to college. And what you don't see in this photo is the moment that occurs immediately afterwards, after she reaches out and shakes his hand, which is that he kind of emerged, smiling, and conversed with her and remained present throughout the entire visit. And for those of us who knew him and had been kind of pained by his struggle over the last year or two, we were astounded. And the following week, he said to me, Connie, can you bring more people like that to the bike shop? And, I've thought about that, like what exactly that visit with Madame Taubira meant to him. I can't say what the meaning was, but that being in relation, as you said, Roberto, I think that was so important. And the fact that she so clearly reached out to him and shook his hand and talked to him, and that fact that she was someone that I had described as being, genuinely admirable, and that she gave these moments to him and recognized him. And it's that moment of reconnaissance, I think, of recognition of his value, that to me was what was absolutely transformative. I don't know to what degree it mattered to him that she is French, that she is of African descent, but he described the visit as dope, so it was very good, But I think that overcoming linguistic and cultural, racial, and other kinds of differences and barriers can occur, in these moments of being in relation and finding ways of creating those opportunities. And, I believe that whether you're speaking to someone in another language or just any other human being, that it is a human endeavor generally to always be working toward translating one's experience in another person's experience. And I think that happens in every day, whether we're all speaking English or whether we're, speaking a foreign language to someone else. It is just who we are. You know, we are never another human being. We are always trying to translate and always trying to find that way of being in relation. And so this to me was a very important moment for me in discovering, you know, the importance of bringing someone to this context, to this place, and the kind of transformative power that it can have.
Connie, thank you so much for the story and for the framing, especially thinking about the connection between Roberto's phrase around being in relation and this concept of translation. Roberto, Connie has queued you up so wonderfully for you to think about and help us think about how translation, broadly interpreted, operates in your world, in our world here in the East Bay in Oakland.
You know, listen, I want to thank Connie and Anya. You're just like, my mind is just like percolating, and there's no rhyme or reason, but I just love everything that you're doing. So thank you. You know, immediately I've been working with a Native American artist collective called Post Commodity, and I've been working with them for a number of years, and they're on the border, and I wrote a piece for them a while back that I just rewrote called "The Sovereignty of Context." So I just want to bring that into this sort of conversation about context and how do I translate your stories, your context to my town, where I am a public servant. And so, you know, Shannon, one of your favorite terms, and what that means to be a public servant to operate in the world of translating knowledges related to locales, to neighborhoods, to cultural heritage. And as a public servant, you need to sort of have a bit of a skill set related to translating. And maybe that's where I lean into the word relation. I don't want necessarily relationships per se. I mean, they're an important part, but I want to think, how do I exist in relation to somebody else? And I guess I see the 15 minutes to Q&A. So I want one comment to Anya, the story of the music thing. And it kind of goes back to, I was talking to a poet here in town named Tanya Forster. She's great. And we were talking about creative placemaking. And she talks about it in terms of affect, the poesy of creative placemaking, how we have Chicago blues, we have New Orleans blues, we have Oakland blues. We don't talk about our locales in terms of their sound that often. We might talk about it, because I'm older, in terms of dance moves. You know, there was a Philly dance stamp steps. And so in some ways, I just like the fact that, and this is where I'm a bit of an interloper, I want to in my active translation usually are kind of making the boundaries a little more porous. So if urban planners and architects dominate the discourse around placemaking, what happens when you bring a poet to the table and they'll start telling you about sound and lyricism? That is an important part of making a locale. And I will go back to my other language thing about the sovereignty of context. That locale has context and governance as it relates to the context of Oakland, Deep East, Fruitvale, all my neighborhoods. I need to know how the juice works in them and who has agency and who doesn't have agency. And my job is not necessarily giving, my job is mainly to listen. I'll just stop.
Wonderful, Roberto, both thinking about public service as an act of translation and then moving into what we thought might be the last topic of reflection. And I'll just bring it up before we open to Q&A, also telling people in the audience that if you do have a question or a reaction, to use the Q&A function in the chat, and we'll be attempting to get to your questions in just a bit. But the last topic, again, just very on the heels of what Roberto just said, is to really think about the art part in all of it. That the arts, that when we're talking about translation across cities, within neighborhoods, we're talking about issues of equity. What is the juice that the arts bring? And it might not bring the same thing in all cases. And it also doesn't always take the same form, right? Whether it's storytelling, dance, murals, etc. So perhaps I'll just, as a way to both expedite and also just to get a lot more images and thoughts in the air, I'll ask Connie, then Roberto, then Juliette, then Anya, if that's all right. Connie, Juliette, Connie, Roberto, Juliette, and Anya to talk, just to help us dial in at this conversation sponsored by the Arts and Design at Berkeley. What's the art part really in all of this for you?
For me, the art part comes out of some experiences that we've had. We had, and I'll just briefly talk about this, in the fall of 2019, we hosted Dorothée Mounianeza and Nicolas Détry at Experimental Station, and they were there for a couple of months doing an art residency. And a lot of what the question that was kind of posed during that time that I think is appropriate here is thinking about how you translate and share experiences of marginalization and trauma. And Dorothée had, her roots are in Rwanda, even though she ended up in London and now in France. But when she came to Chicago a few years ago, she came to the realization that there was such a the kind of ubiquity of trauma in our Black communities in America, and made parallels, created parallels in her mind with what happened in Rwanda. And so when she did her residency, she brought some young people you see in the photo on the right together, and over an eight-week period, brought them together for these kind of sessions. Nicolas would make dinner in the evening, and then everyone would share some dinner and fellowship. And then she would take this group of young men off to kind of process and express, but also through physical movement, but also through language, their experiences. We don't know what was shared there. That was never shared with us. But when they left, there were true tears, and these young people brought their friends. So these were the young men from the south side of Chicago, who had experienced all forms of trauma, and found real meaning in this. And Dorothée, being an artist, choreographer, musician, and also a very spiritual person, she was able, through these various forms, to engage with these young men and bring out in them, their stories of their experiences that they were able to share. So as we go forward in the next few years, this year with Clichy Chicago, we're really excited. We'll be bringing hip hop artist, sorry, I'm spacing, Bentu Dombedi to Chicago and to the South Side. And the following year, Alice Diop, and Alice, who is a documentary filmmaker and who gives voice to the marginalized. And so we're very excited about having her come and participate in this Clichy Chicago project. And then we'll be doing artist exchanges in both directions and creating a series of videos that will give voice also to some of the folks on the South Side for a June event that will take place this year. So there are a variety of art practices and events that will take place as a result.
Fabulous. Thank you, Connie. Roberto, thinking anything more you'd like to add to this question beyond also how you already launched the conversation with your last disquisition around the juice of all of your neighborhoods?
Let me talk about that, circle all the way back to the cultural plan. and belonging, and belonging as a form of placemaking and placekeeping and place knowing, all of that. But also, what does it mean for a city to try to assert a civic narrative of belonging? How does that look like? As a grant maker, I try to prompt these kind of imaginations about how do you operationalize belonging in a town that's always highly contested, like all cities are. And so in some ways, that's part of my pleasure. And to go a little bit more specific to an upcoming project that I'm helping to facilitate between Oakland and Saint-Denis, and the artist dancer Simone. I always have his heart. What's his last name? Juliette? Anyway,
Okay.
yeah, very good. He's doing a dance piece based on narrative and on story, and really localized stories around home. And it's going to be a stage inside City Hall and the various chambers, a site-specific work that will happen at the end of summer. Because City Hall won't open up officially for a while, but we can get 20, 25 people moving around. So it's kind of nice to have that vessel, City Hall, sitting there waiting for an artist to animate it. So that is good. That's good.
I have to just say, it's really exciting to think that it's really going to happen, that project. We've just had an event where we haven't talked about COVID. Oh my gosh. All right, Juliette, can you tell us, I mean, there's so much to say about what's going on in France, but I know you might share, yes, Grand Paris Express, what's going on there? It would be so interesting for all of us in the Bay Area.
Yes, I think, thinking about one project that embodies what we are talking about is how to make sure that we are making cities collectively, and how do we make sure that we invite artists to be part of the urban planning, but at every single step of the making of the city. So Paris and Saint-Denis is preparing itself to host the 2024 Olympic Games. And at the same time, Paris and the Grand Paris, the metropolis, are creating 68 new stations, meaning that the public transport will be the face of the public transport all around Paris will change. And I think more than that, it's not really like the 68 new stations are really important, but it's more the way they are inviting artists to be part of the process. So the Grand Paris Express, which is the name of the project, what they did and what they are still doing every day is just like they're inviting artists to define the project with an architect, to engage in a dialogue with the different communities in the different venues around Paris. And what they are doing, and we can go at Paris on the next slide, we're talking a huge construction. It's going to take 10 or 15 years. So what they do is like they are opening up the different construction sites, meaning like for the neighborhoods, think like the construction by itself, it's big time. And instead of having walls where you have like information about the wall, it's just like, how can we open the sites? How can we invite the neighborhoods to be part of the process? And you can see on the different photos, you have different performances. You have very more show and huge show, but you also have a lot of discussion on a day-to-day basis, just to inform and to invite the different neighborhoods and communities to be part of the process. And I think that's exactly, how, when a city is changing so much, how can we build together the city? How can we listen to the different communities to make sure that the project that we are developing is meeting the needs? And so it's this project, I think, is one example, and I think it's one among the other, but I think it's a really nice and interesting one.
An incredibly ambitious one as well, and employing a lot of artists. So, absolutely wonderful. Anya, maybe you can close us out with helping us think about how the arts function in your practice. And before we take questions from the audience, which are queuing up wonderfully.
I'll go real quick. I would just respond a little bit to Roberto's instigation as well, that art allows us to express what it means to be human. So when we build stage sets and scenographies, we try to be as hauntological as possible. In other words, to refer to something that happened in the landscape, in the context prior to us arriving, in order to connect with the multi-layers of narrative that invariably happens there. And if we go to the next slide, those hauntological scenographies give us an alibi to tell a multiplicity of stories, to record sound, to feature artists, to feature poetry, to create publications and other modes of media. And what we're trying to do in our practice, and if we just move on to the next slide, is to scale that up to a district-wide ambition and to test what it means to radically include a multiplicity of voices through multimedia phenomenon and through lots of different ways of engaging in order to imagine a cultural landscape that's inclusive, adaptable, can be appropriated, and offers a sense of belonging. And that kind of work takes an enormous amount of time. So if we go to the next slide, it incorporates opening storefronts, featuring artists in scenarios where they talk about their own work rather than talking about the space that houses their work, and constantly creating an ambition toward equity between multiple institutions. So this is a project that attempts to unify 12 existing institutions and blur property lines, which is very difficult in the American context, and especially in Detroit, so that there is a sense of equity despite the radical differences in scale, scope, and aspiration. So I'll stop there.
Well, incredible too. Also, just even with that last sentiment of saying that it's about also blurring property lines, which, as a couple of you have said, one of the issues around creative placemaking has been, sort of whether it is about reinforcement around property or something like the opposite or something different, and incredible scale. Thank you so much, especially I think as we start to think about some of the questions that are coming from the audience, Anya's last set of images is apt, in part because we're seeing models shared with us online right now. We're gathering together online. The theme of this series is called Together, Reinventing Politics, Reimagining Health, but the notion of togetherness as an offline and online experience is something that we're dealing with constantly every day, and something that of course is very much a part of the delivery of even our dialogue now. And it relates to a question that's coming from the audience from Stephen Raspa. Hi, Stephen from Burning Man Project. It's great to have you joining us. He's asking how these ideas about shared experience manifest themselves in the digital notion of place and space. And does that complicate or enhance the work you understand yourselves to be doing? How does the digital also further relate to the idea of context? So, elephant in the room, elephant in the Zoom room.
One of the things about, and I'll mention COVID, and I mentioned, seeing the collapse of so much in our lives. And the one thing that I am very mindful of is the collapse of social relationships and social networks. So the old way, now we have a new social network, Zoomland. And, it's like, I give it about a C minus. So in that emergence of another kind of social network, beyond, let's say, the neighborhood walk or the neighborhood corner store in that network, or the barbershop or the cafe, and how all these things are going to unfold, it's going to be rather amazing. But I know that part of the recovery that a city has to do is rebuild social networks. It's just essential. If you don't feel that you belong, then it's gonna be really hard to have a sense of social cohesion. So let's, I mean, I'm an old man, so digital is like what I don't have to learn everything. But I think about that social network part.
Is there one other who might want to jump in on that question from Stephen?
I think it's a fascinating question, just insofar that digital scenography does not need to emulate or replicate real world experience. It's something completely other. So this is a little bit weird, but we can certainly make it even stranger. And we are unbound by economy of means. We don't need to pay for airline tickets. And so a radical complicity is possible internationally and across ideologies, and that's exciting. Simultaneously, this situation underscores how much we need real space to get together again, because the binary opposition between live-work has been undermined, at least for a certain class. The outcomes of that for working class people is going to be economically devastating. And we're going to need to figure out how to talk about what brings us together. And that's just to fold it back to this question of art and culture. It's much more likely that we'll be coming together again for art and culture rather than office space in our cities. And so preparing for that moment and understanding that that investment is extraordinarily important, I think is the next step, but it's very different from the digital world.
Oh, I just love that thought, Anya, as we're all talking about, as there's, articles everywhere about the devastation of the commercial real estate world. Well, wait a minute, we might be coming together under new auspices. Yeah?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm excited about it.
Okay, very interesting. It actually relates to another question that came up in the chat, I think, around the role of physical installation. So we've been talking a lot about relational elements, about what it is to be in relation, about what it is to understand varieties of people. And when we talk about relationships, we're talking about something that often isn't necessarily about a physical installation, but a question from Ariella for Roberto, but I think anyone could take it up, is what about the physical aspects of things that can be constructed, perhaps as convening spaces when planning a city? What will add and enhance that sentiment of belonging amongst community members? So the discourse will, relationships will. What about physical aspects in the city?
It's a really good question. I help facilitate public art in Oakland, and so I see that field kind of and a bit of angst about it, because there's definitely a lot of reflection on public space and how to animate public space. Anya, your facade thing, it's like, wow, my town would eat you up, but that's kind of a new publicness that's not necessarily the same as a monument, and the notion of monument is changing. At the same time, George Floyd, the aftermath was this downtown all of a sudden became boarded up at a million. There was hundreds of murals, and so we had this DIY. I'm gonna make art. I'm going to make sculpture. I'm just going to put it in a public space and make that space different. So I think that's an answer, a riff.
Anyone else have a thought or want to respond about the physical in any of your projects?
I would respond. I think that there is I would have a concern that it depends on who has access to that physical space, or that whatever is constructed. I look at Chicago and, an art project that was downtown and located downtown all of a sudden had homeless people gather at that project, and that project was moved. And so like who is allowed to have access to that project and that would enable them to have a sense of belonging. I don't think that you can just simply create a project and put it there and that it would foster that. I think it has a lot to do with who is allowed to participate in it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's the good and the bad of what we can do online and what we can do offline, and that there's certain kinds of access that are prohibited with one and certain different kinds of access that are prohibited with the other. Yeah, so what did you call it, Anya, earlier? A kind of radical something that we can do online right now?
I'm not sure anymore, but sometimes it feels like promiscuity, but sometimes it feels like, but sometimes it feels like something better, like alignment.
Right. So that there's a way that the online thing is perhaps allowing for a kind of promiscuity that physical space does not allow, per Connie's point, that some kinds of access are prohibited if we rely only on physicality, and again, vice versa, who's in and who's out can be differently managed. Oh, radical complicity. Thank you. Terry Scott is remembering better than you and me. You're great. So thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
All right. Also, there's another question that's for Juliette, but I also think that everybody could be dipping into this one about thinking about the varieties of ways that people occupy. That would maybe be a word, or you could say engage with multiple communities, elaborating on the geographic, ideological, and ephemeral distinctions that Juliette outlined. So geographic, ideological, ephemeral, that might have come up in the discourse around translation or other places, but those are different, you could say, sort of domains of engagement or scales of engagement, or formats for engagement. And I wonder, Juliette, maybe you could lead us, but in terms of what you meant, but I'd also invite anybody else to jump in.
I would also use, I don't know if it's layers, it's different circles of engagement, and it's you start from one point and you meet with different person, different communities who just open new windows. And then you take the time to understand those windows, and then you just open another circle. And I think that's what we try to do, and what we're trying to do with this project, and even trying to involve more and more communities in Oakland and in Saint-Denis, and engaging the dialogue with other cities. But it doesn't mean that it's already closed in Oakland and in Saint-Denis. It's just other circles with Detroit, with Chicago, and even we are starting discussion with New Delhi and Nairobi in Kenya. But for me, it's different circles, and at each time, just to take the time to understand exactly what do we learn from this new discussion, and how we can engage in another one. I think I would say that there is no one solution. It's just one way to do it, but at least just to be aware of how can we invite different people at the table.
Lovely, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in and respond?
It's kind of related, but I want to talk to Anya's last project, and you talked about sort of like scaling it. And that's like a term that I always makes me uncomfortable, because cities and management wants to believe that you scale up, and in reality, the best engagement is you scale out. And what does scaling out look like in your context, in your project, where you want to work in multiple neighborhoods? If you want to, in multiple communities, and you still want to sort of scale, what does that look like? We're not really taught very often how to scale out. You're supposed to accumulate more wealth and buy more property. Anyway, but that's a good homework assignment for you, Anya.
For the next few years. Thank you.
Well, we're officially at the end of our time here at 8 o'clock, having sort of come for full circle with, I think, a new prompt from Roberto to question even more vocabulary, to getting from so scaling up is going to become scaling out, and this.
I have to make this editorial comment, because in communities-based work, it's always been about scaling out, and
There you go.
it's always been about scaling out, and those social networks are about scaling out. And I think just capitalism wants us to only think of up.
Yes, so there you go. There's nothing new about scaling out. It's more about validating that kind of vocabulary. And Yolanda is calling it horizontal knowledge, a kind of horizontal practice. Wonderful. Thank you. I just can't tell you how exciting I found this dialogue, how privileged I am to learn more about your practices, Connie and Anya, in Detroit and in Chicago, my former hometown. To be able to welcome again to our space colleagues who are so important to us, Juliette and Roberto, so important to me and to all of us at Berkeley who care about the future of the Bay Area. And also to contribute all that you've contributed explicitly and implicitly to our ideas about what it means to be together, aesthetically, politically, technologically, especially given the incredible practices, the precise practices, and the very precise ways that you talk about it. You're truly an inspiring group, and it's really been a privilege to welcome you. I'll ask the audience who's here, who stuck it out with us here to the end, if you don't mind offering a warm, if muted, thank you to these luminaries for joining us. I'd really appreciate it. And we'll tune in next Monday. So thank you, Juliette, Connie, Anya, and Roberto.
Thank you.
Big hugs.
Thanks so much.
Bisous.
Bye.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Bye.